Good afternoon, friends. I'm Joe Chuman, and I'd like to welcome you to our ongoing series of interviews with noted writers, most often on contemporary subjects and topics of interest. And this afternoon's interview is certainly very much that. Before I introduce our guest, let me say a few words about myself. I'm a leader of the New York Society for Ethical Culture, and for many years have taught human rights in the graduate school at Columbia University and at times at Hunter College as well. And I also worked for the United Nations at its University for Peace in Costa Rica. My guest this afternoon is Professor David Hollinger. Professor Hollinger is the Emeritus Professor of History at the University of California at Berkeley. He's an authority on American religion. He's written and edited at least a dozen books on religion and related fields, as well as related figures. And I should say, I am most pleased and privileged to be interviewing Dr. Hollinger this afternoon on his most recent book, Christianity's American Fate, subtitled How Religion Became More Conservative and Society More Secular. And let me just show you a copy of this really handsome book. Here it is, Christianity's American Fate. And I'd just like to mention that I came by way of this book through reading a laudatory review of it by Linda Greenhouse, professor of law at Yale and longtime writer for the New York Times on the Supreme Court, who just had a review in the New York Review of Books on Professor Hollinger's text, as well as others on the related topic that we'll be dealing with right now. Okay. Welcome, David
Well,
Hollinger.
thanks. Very glad to be here,
Okay,
Joe.
great to
Good.
see you. Finally meet you. As I mentioned before the show, while I was working on my doctorate in religion at Columbia, I often came across your work and really admired it. So it's really a great opportunity for me to finally meet you
Thank
after
you.
all these years this afternoon. Okay, we're going to be talking about the political emergence of evangelical Christianity in America, how they became, through their own efforts, identified as Christians, as if to imply other Christians are really not such, and their relationship to what you refer to as ecumenical Protestantism or ecumenical Christianity, and how the dynamics of these groups have actually led to a greater secularization of American society. Okay, let's get underway. We need some descriptions of some of these broad terms and phenomena. You basically contrast what you call ecumenical Protestantism with evangelical Protestantism. And ecumenical, as you explained, Protestantism is virtually a synonym for what I referred to or sort of grew up with understanding of as mainline Protestant churches: Lutherans, Presbyterians, United Church of Christ, Methodists, and a few others. You refer to them primarily as ecumenical Protestants. Can you talk about the two branches of Protestantism in America and how they differ from each other?
Yeah, that's a very important thing for us to keep in mind as we study the contemporary world. It's a tradition, it's a split that goes a long way back. I mean, all the way through the 19th century, you had what Martin Marty calls the two-party system of Protestantism, where you have one group of people that is more focused on personal salvation and personal behavior, and that's the tradition that we call evangelical. And then there's another tradition that was much more concerned with society. And this leads into the social gospel of the early 20th century and to the modernist movement. Now, the fundamentalists of the 1920s and 30s are the inheritors of one of those traditions, the one that focuses more on personal morality and, and a very literal understanding of scripture, whereas the modernists are more responsive to the world around them, to science, and interested in the social implications of the gospel. But then what happens and I should say also that in the 1940s, the term of art for what later becomes mainline is actually liberal. So you talk a lot about liberal Protestants, and the term mainline doesn't come in until about 1960.
Hmm.
which is ironic because shortly after that, the mainline churches, the Episcopalians and the Methodists and the Presbyterians and so forth, they began their famous decline. So they're not very mainline long after they were called that.
Hmm.
But the reason that mainline caught on is that by that time, the 40s and 50s, these uh, classic denominations, the Presbyterians, the Methodists, the Congregationalists, and so forth, they really were very prominent in the United States, socially, economically, and politically. So that was considered mainline. Now, during those years, 40s and 50s, the other party, which is the fundamentalist tradition that renames itself evangelical in the mid 1940s,
Mm.
those people were sort of regarded as rustics, and the big time Episcopalians and Presbyterians and Methodists and so forth thought of these people as kind of poor country cousins, and there was a very patronizing attitude toward them. And what happened is that the mainline liberal Protestants, and I'll explain why I call them ecumenical in a moment, they are very naive about the capabilities of these rustics. And so what happens is the evangelicals are very enterprising, and they create their own networks and their own journals, their own schools, and so forth. So they become very prominent in ways that I think we'll be talking about later in this conversation. Okay, why ecumenical? Because the term liberal isn't specific enough to the religious practice of these people. The term mainline has become anachronistic. So
Hmm.
I alternate in my writings within all of these terms. Now, the advantage of the term ecumenical is that it speaks to a religious practice of these people. It's not just a social term or a political term. They're ecumenical because these Presbyterians and Congregationalists and so forth, they wanted to connect with a lot of people who felt differently about the world than they did. They were willing to cooperate with just about anybody that called themselves Christians, and they, even though they were anti-Catholic, there were many overtures to sort of try to get along with the Catholics, and they were willing to deal also with groups that were not even Christian. So they were willing to deal with secularists. So they're ecumenical in that they're willing to embrace a whole series of different alliances. Now, while that's happening, while the liberals on their way to becoming mainline are practicing this ecumenical type religion, the old fundamentalists, when they reclassify themselves as evangelicals, they're going the opposite direction.
Hmm.
They're saying, we got the faith, and all these liberals, they're sellouts. I mean, these people that are ecumenicals, they're going off and making common cause with all these Hindus and Muslims and atheists and free thinkers. And so we, evangelicals, they would say, are not at all ecumenical in that sense, that we are true to the faith and these people are betraying it. So there's a real split that develops. And the reason I keep focusing on the 40s, okay, that's when the evangelicals begin to establish their amazing network of organizations and schools and media stuff. So in 1942, they established the National Association of Evangelicals. 1947, they established Fuller Theological Seminary. In the early 50s, thanks to a lot of money that the oil magnates give to Billy Graham and his family, they established Christianity Today, which becomes much more prominent than Christian Century, which is the old house organ of the ecumenical Protestants. But what happens when all this money comes into Christianity Today, it immediately, outdoes Christian Century in terms of circulation and all. So you got these two traditions, and they have different emphases, and they draw on a long history through the 19th century, but they become much more sharply defined in the 1940s and 50s. Hope that makes sense, Joe.
No, absolutely does. Now, one point you make is very interesting, and that is it was conventionally assumed that to be an ecumenical Protestant was easier for the believer than to be an evangelical. The evangelical was more stringent in the demands of faith and belief, and as you seem to be implying, that to be an ecumenical could involve a whole diversity of different beliefs and was not doctrinally as demanding, so it was easier to be an ecumenical Protestant than it was to be an evangelical, and yet you invert that. You say, in effect, it was the opposite.
Yeah, this is one of the things that I think makes my book the most different from a lot of other things on the shelf, and that is that it enters in a very explicit way uh, a debate that's been going on for more than 50 years about the decline of the mainline ecumenical Protestants. And in the early 70s, there's a book written arguing that, well, it's actually not so hard to figure out. Evangelical churches are flourishing because they really make demands on the individual. The ecumenical mainline liberal Protestants, they're not making much demand of anything. You know, they're just sort of going along with the culture of the United States. And in order for religion to flourish, you've got to really make some demands on people. Okay. Now that's a very popular line, and that's been articulated again and again by the historians who worry about this stuff and the officers of the various religious organizations. Okay, I spin that exactly around on the following grounds that these liberal ecumenical Protestants say if we're going to be Christian now in the mid 20th century, we've got to come to grips with two challenges. The first challenge is we now live in an increasingly diverse society, ethno-racially. And we have to deal with this. We can't just ignore the racial character of American society. We can't ignore the history of white supremacy. We've got to do something about this. So one of the challenges is to respond to racism in American life and to racial diversity. Second challenge is we live in a society that's increasingly science related. Educational level is increasing. We're a very scientifically oriented culture, and we really need a religion that's responsive to this. So we have to confront the challenges of a scientifically oriented culture and an ethno-racially diverse society. Now, what happens with the evangelicals is that this is a way to be a good Christian without worrying about either of those two things. Evangelicalism flourishes in the 1960s, 70s, and since that time as a safe harbor for white people who really want to be counted as Christians. They want that. They want Christian identity. They don't want their Christian creds challenged, but they want to do this without meeting the demands that the ecumenical liberal mainline people say. Right. So what happens is that the mainliners are actually making Christianity more demanding. Mm-hmm. You know, they're saying we got to stop white supremacy. We got to fight imperialism as abroad. We got to oppose the Vietnam War, stuff like that. Whereas the evangelical leaders are saying, "Oh, that's politics. That's not religion. That's politics." And we do not want Christianity to turn itself into something political. You know, as though the Jim Crow system wasn't political from the get-go. And so these, you know, educated liberal Protestants of ecumenicals, these people in the seminaries, they're trying to say, listen, Christianity has always been embedded in history. And part of the challenge that Christian leaders have had ever since Paul the Apostle is to try to figure out how to articulate and practice the faith in a specific historic context. So here we are in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s, and 70s with these conditions. So we should respond to those conditions. We should be, for our own time, what Paul the Apostle was in his. Instead of just copying Paul the Apostle, we should act independently in the best traditions of the faith.
Right.
Well, this doesn't play at all well. A lot of white people, who are quite happy to, you go to a Billy Graham rally, he wants you to accept Christ. Well, you can accept Christ without doing any of this other stuff. That's why I say that evangelicalism was an easy way out.
Yeah. Okay. Now you'd mentioned in your current remarks that evangelicals were critical of ecumenical Protestantism because they were involved in politics, whereas evangelicals at that time identified themselves, I suspect, as being non-political. However, and I want to bring this towards the end of our discussion to the current moment and how religion is a powerful influence in terms of shaping the political landscape at this moment in ways that I think are very ominous, as the evangelicals have become, in my view, an overwhelmingly political force. I mean, I had interviewed Professor Randy Balmer a few weeks ago in this series, and he basically said, as someone who was born an evangelical and feels betrayed and abandoned by the evangelical movement, that it basically has lost its soul, that it's become nothing but a political movement, and its internal religious and faith commitments are virtually evaporated. I want to talk about that transition and how it informs what I consider to be the ominous, irrational, crazy, and dangerous political situation that we confront now. But I want to put that on the shelf a little bit until we reach, the end. One thing, and this, I want to get into the question, the other motif in your book about the increased secular character of American society. And correct me if I'm wrong, it seems that from the founding of the Republic through every decades, Americans are becoming more religious if you use religious affiliation with religious congregations as an index of religiosity up until a few decades ago. And then it began to radically shift so that something like 30% of Americans at least claim no religious affiliation. Among younger cohorts, millennials and so forth, it's even much higher. And that abandonment of traditional religion seems to be increasing, which we can identify with a growing secularization of American society. There's some sociologists that think that at long last, America is beginning to follow Western Europe, where churches are basically museums in many places, and that we're moving in that direction. Okay, so I want to talk about that major movement and how it happens and what the indices are. Let me start by citing something I think you mentioned in passing, that that it would be fair to interpret the ecumenical Protestant churches, previously referred to as liberal, as basically broadly identifying with the program of the Enlightenment. Okay, and I think we can look at evangelicals as being very often self-consciously anti-Enlightenment. I look at the adoption of anti-Darwinism. I look at the whole fundamentalist notion of inerrancy, the refusal to look at critical views of the Bible, and so on and so forth, as being an anti-Enlightenment posture. And one wonders whether, in the move towards secularization, the mainline churches, by adopting, broadly speaking, an Enlightenment posture, have been an element in propelling the movement of American society towards greater secularization. Is that a legitimate analysis?
Well, Joe, you've just covered some of the main themes of all of American history in
Oh,
that
well,
one
there you
long
go. Right.
sentence. So that's great. Let me come into that at several points.
Sure.
The United States has long been seen as an exception to classic secularization theory.
Uh-huh.
So all these European societies, Germany and France and England, Scandinavia, through the 19th century and the early 20th century, religion is less and less important. People don't go to church as often. The whole culture changes gradually. Not the United States. So when Tocqueville comes to this country in the 1830s, when Max Weber comes in 1904, these guys are gobsmacked by American exceptionalism. And what's exceptional about it is that so many people go to church and they're religious. So during the 19th century, the United States actually becomes a more church-going, more faith-affirming society than it was even at the end of the 18th. So now that happens partly because of immigration. So you have all these new people coming in that they need settings, they need institutions for intimacy and belonging. And churches can do that wonderfully in the United States, partly because of the church-state separation that the Constitution establishes. So
Sure.
they come from societies where the church is part of the government. So you're not independent. Whereas the 19th century US, I mean, all these people from different countries all over Europe, they're able to establish their ethnically related congregations. So religion flourishes in the 19th century, and that makes it really different than Europe. And that's why the secularization theorists are always talking about how different the United States is. Now, at the same time, Protestantism in the United States, as carried out by the leading preachers, by the people at the div schools, by the prominent intellectuals and scholars, people like Channing and Parker and so forth, these people do indeed try to develop a Christianity that is congruent with the Enlightenment, with the Enlightenment's critical perspective on belief and the Enlightenment's relatively generous view of human capability. So you have something like the social gospel coming out of this tradition at the end of the 19th century because of the view that, well, human beings can actually do something. We can make life better. And part of our Christian duty is to do that. So that's an Enlightenment idea, comes out of the Enlightenment. And at the same time, these liberals becoming ecumenicals, eventually called mainline, these people on the critical view of belief side of the Enlightenment, they absorb the higher criticism, which is to say they absorb the historical perspectives on the Bible.
Right.
So they understand that Genesis was pieced together from several fragments of people living centuries apart. They understand that Isaiah was made by 2, if not 3, authors living centuries apart. They understand that some of the letters of Paul the Apostle were not even written by Paul. So there's a willingness to see that even the truest of faiths was developed by real people in real historical time. Now, that view from a liberal Protestant point of view is just fine. I mean, that's possible. You can be a good Christian and believe that. People on the other side, this evangelical proto-fundamentalist side, they're very bothered by that. Fundamentalism develops actually mostly as a reaction against the higher criticism rather than against Darwinism. We talk a lot about evolution and the Scopes trial and all forth. And okay, that's part of it. But at the time, that was in the teens and 20s, the big deal with the fundamentalists was actually the higher criticism because it challenged the very basis for being against evolution. Okay. Why are you against evolution? Well, it goes against Scripture. Okay. Well, what if scholarship says Scripture itself is a contingent product of historically embedded human beings? So the Enlightenment then generates this liberalized faith, a different version of it. Now, to be sure, the American Protestants that developed this Enlightenment-inflected version of Christianity are copying pretty exactly German theologians. So Germany is in the forefront of the developing liberal Protestantism, and they carry this forward. So as we get down into the middle decades of the 20th century, we're dealing with a liberal Protestantism that is very friendly to Enlightenment traditions, and we're dealing with a fundamentalist evangelical tradition that doesn't want to hear about that begins to talk about inerrancy. The Scriptures are inerrant. They're true literally and eternally. We don't need biblical criticism. We don't need to understand the multiple readings of Isaiah, but we need multiple authorship. What we need to understand is that this is a book that holds together firmly, and we just need to put together its various parts. So there's a radically different view of biblical hermeneutics, of how we interpret Scripture, but of these two traditions. So if we want to talk about secularization, you can say that the response to the Enlightenment is a way in which Christianity, as expressed through liberal Protestantism, becomes more open to a world beyond the Christian community as set up by Paul with all these various rules. So that's one big part of it. Now, at the same time, we need to remember that these large historical trends that the secularization theorists talk about, like modernization, like the growth of education, the expansion of education, the growth of democracy. So the secularization theorists are saying as society becomes more modernized, as more and more people have security and they're not afraid of being killed by somebody down the street at any time, the greater security, these things lead people to be less devoted to traditional religion and more inclined to accept secular understandings of things in secular communities. That's what these sociologists that talk about secularization say. Yeah. And that's why the United States was different, because there wasn't much of that. But as you just said, Joe, the trend more recently is that the sociologists are now saying, well, the United States is becoming more like Europe in that sense, that all these other things are more accepted. Now, why are they more accepted? They're more accepted partly because the liberal Protestants are okay with engaging it, while the evangelical Protestants are still, putting that off to the side and very reluctant to go that way. Now, there are two other things that I want to mention that affect the acceleration, the speed, and the character of the secularization of American society since the 1930s. Two things that are really important and that are America-specific. I've been talking about these grand modernization trends. Okay, that's there. Two things happen in the United States. One is the Protestants send abroad all these missionaries, and they go to Japan and they go to China and India, the Middle East and so forth, beginning especially in the 1890s. I mean, yes, we got missionaries going back to the 1820s and 30s, but the 1890s, the American Protestant establishment gets really interested in missions. So they send all these people abroad. And of course, the mission is to make them like us. They wouldn't have put it that way, but we understand historically that they really did imagine that they had swallowed the canary, and what it meant to be a true Christian was, what the folks in Dubuque, Iowa were doing in 1905.
That's the point of missionizing, I guess. Right?
That's right. So they try to. What happens is, this doesn't happen to all of them, but especially the missionaries that are reasonably well educated, and a lot of them had very strong class position. I mean, if you went out as a missionary in 1910, you might be a graduate of Yale or Holyoke or Princeton or Oberlin, something like that. So, or often a graduate of Union Theological Seminary or Princeton Theological Seminary, Yale did, something like that. So these people go abroad and they come back transformed. Not all of them, and they're a matter of degree, but what the substance is, they come back saying, wait a minute, we're not so right about everything. All of these people, all these Hindus, all these Buddhists, so forth, all these Muslims, they've got a society that has real integrity to it. They've thought this through. They have classic documents. They have a life that has a certain coherence to it. And we should be, not so arrogant about this. Mm-hmm. We shouldn't be calling them heathens. Maybe they're brothers and sisters. So especially about 1920s, 1930s, the educated elite of the Protestant churches begins turning against proselytization and against the classic missionary project. And they are big on ethno-racial diversity, because this matter of religious diversity is connected to ethno-racial diversity. So they begin saying that the Jim Crow system and American white supremacy is really bad. And one of the reasons we know it's bad is we've looked around the world and we have a more world historical sense of this. So this then creates a momentum away from traditional understandings of Christianity and a cosmopolitan appreciation for the diversity of the human species, which doesn't always lead people outside the church, but a lot of them, it does. Famous example, Pearl Buck, the Nobel laureate, one of the really important writers in all American history. Okay, she's a missionary and a missionary child. She leaves Christianity altogether.
Hmm.
John Hersey, a missionary child, grew up in China, wrote the great book Hiroshima in 1945, very sensitive to the humanity of the Japanese people.
Hmm.
Okay, he also leaves the faith. Now, most of the people who are inspired by missionaries or experience that don't leave the faith altogether, but a lot of them do. And over time, that increases. Now, as this liberalization of the uh, ecumenical mainline side of Protestantism is going on, and as many of these people leave the churches, yielding the statistics that you quoted a while ago, Joe, about how now like 29 or 30% of the people say they have no religious affiliation. While this is happening, the edifice of American Christianity is hollowed out, and evangelicals and Christian nationalists among the evangelicals, they come in and they occupy that space, allied with the most conservative of the Catholics. Now, in the meantime, Catholicism has experienced a similar change. I mean, 40% of let me back up a little bit. If you're looking at the demography of the Catholic Church between about 1970 and about 2010, the traditional European ethnic base declines by 40%. Now, there are new Catholics. There are a lot of Hispanic Catholics. So it's complicated. But the traditional European stock for Catholicism radically declines at about the same pace.
We're talking about Irish and Italians
That's right.
primarily, I
Yeah,
guess, right?
it declines
Culture,
about
yeah.
the same pace as the ecumenical Protestant churches do. So secularization involves all of these stages. And right now, something that's so striking about it is that many of the people who gradually left these Protestant and Catholic churches, but didn't sort of own up to it, because in this society, going to church is sort of considered a wholesome thing to do. Finally, like there's a tipping point. So as of about 8 or 9 years ago, when you get up to about 10 or 15% of people willing to say that they're not affiliated, many of the people who were actually not affiliated but didn't own up to it when Gallup came around to ask them, so now they're admitting it. So suddenly we've got this enormous growth of what the social scientists call the nuns. Yeah. What's your affiliation? None. So that's going. The other thing that happens, I'll finish in a moment, then I'll turn back to you. The other thing is that Christianity is increasingly given a face of Christian nationalism, a face of anti-intellectualism, a face of this white evangelical ethos. Now, not all Christians are that way, but if you want to look at the edifice of Christianity and what its contours are, that's very different than it used to be. So if you have somebody growing up in any kind of setting, and they're just trying to figure out, gee, am I going to affiliate with this outfit or not? That's an enormous disincentive for a lot of young people. Do you really want to be part of this Christian nationalist stuff? Well, some do, but an awful lot do not.
Okay.
Hence, secularization.
Right. I want to get to that towards the end because it does play in so powerfully and ominously to the politics of the moment, including Donald Trump and the support that he's received, and the conspiracy theories and the irrationality, the divisiveness, tribalism, and everything that really threatens, I think, American democracy and the coherence of the nation. I want to get to that and how religion is a major player in that. So I want to do that. I want to ratchet back a little bit and just talk a little bit about religious demographics, particularly if there are any younger people who will be watching this. I grew up as a Jewish kid in New York City in the 1950s, and I felt, although it was never explicitly articulated to me as a third or fourth grader, that I was living in a Protestant dominant country and that I, in some sense, was not a fully enfranchised American. That may sound strange, but I felt as a child as an outsider. When I went to a primarily Jewish elementary school, but when the day started, we all congregated in the auditorium and an assistant principal or a gym teacher or whatever would stand up in front of us and read verses from the New Testament. I said, my goodness, this is weird. And as a kid, I felt there was something strange about it. I didn't know why it was going on, but it was reflective, I think, implicitly, if not explicitly, of the Protestant dominance of American society. America was a Protestant establishment virtually. Okay. Today, and correct me, I may not be up on the statistics, I think barely 51% of Americans are Protestants. And when you look at, for example, an interesting exemplification is the contemporary Supreme Court. Right? Used to be all Protestants. And today, with the partial exception of Neil Gorsuch, there's not a single Protestant on the US Supreme Court. We have 6 Catholics and 3 Jews, right? That indicates to me a decline in the hegemony of the Protestant demography. Also, one other thing that I think people have to be alerted to is it seems to me that historically, the great divide and animosity in this country was between dominant Protestants, who were the overwhelming majority, and Catholics, who were a feared minority. The Ku Klux Klan basically targeted blacks, of course, as being at the top of their hit list in terms of hate. But beyond it, it wasn't Jews. It was primarily Catholics and Catholic immigrants. And there were all kinds of stories about papist conspiracies of taking over the United States. The divide between Protestants and Catholics was inimical. I can recall, I'm old enough to remember John Kennedy running for office, bending over backwards when he campaigned, that when elected, his highest loyalty would be to the Constitution of the United States and not to the Pope in Rome. He had to repeat that over and over again because anti-Catholic bias was so strong. Norman Vincent Peale, who was Donald Trump's minister, in fact, had started a group of respectable Protestant ministers to sabotage Kennedy's campaign because he was a Catholic and they feared he was a front for the Pope. So that hostility was tremendous. But today, the alignment seems to have changed radically, where conservative evangelical Protestants and conservative Catholics are aligned with each other on one side against the mainline or ecumenical Protestants, secularists, humanists, liberals, and the Democratic Party on the other, right? And it's an interesting, younger people may have no sense of that, of how the Catholic Protestant divide was so strident, and now the configurations have changed so radically, and with them the politics that goes along. I don't know if you could just comment on the demography. I don't know if I got that right, but that's how
I would say that the decline of Anglo-Protestant cultural hegemony in the United States during the last 70, 80, 90 years is a very important thing. And I'm glad that you touched on that. And I want to comment especially on the Jewish immigration and
yes, you have a whole chapter on that, which I thought was fascinating. Yeah.
Before I go to that, I just want to say that with regard to Kennedy, in 1960, if somebody would have said, if we allow a Catholic to become president of the United States, by the early 20th century, there'll be 6 Catholics on the Supreme Court. Now, if you'd have said that, you would have been a bigot.
Right.
Anyway, that's just
very interesting.
Food for thought.
Right.
Okay. Anglo-Protestant cultural hegemony, massive. Now, even though there's this popular antagonism to Catholics as represented by the Klan in the 20s and 30s, and that's definitely there. The Catholics never represented as formidable a challenge to Anglo-Protestant cultural hegemony in the society at large as non-Christians did. And the thing about the Jewish migration is that you have a number of people who become culturally and socially and politically prominent who do not have a Christian background at all. So the fight against the Catholics, as led by the Anglo-Protestants, is that, well, these people are false Christians and we don't want anything to do with them, so forth. I mean, anti-Catholicism is genuinely real. But the Anglo-Protestant establishment in the Congress, in the courts, in business, in universities, in the foundations, in all of the elite institutions. The Anglo-Protestant establishment actually has very little to do with Catholics all the way through the teens and 20s, 30s, 40s, really right down to the 50s. Now, that's because of the difference in class position. Most of the Catholics were not as well educated. They didn't come to this country with artisanal skills. Whereas the Jewish migration, even though much smaller, okay, in 1920, about a fifth of the population of New York was Jewish. National population only about 4%. But the Jews were concentrated in the cultural and economic and political capital of the United States in New York City. And they achieved rapid upward mobility. So as a result of their stronger literacy, much higher literacy than the Catholics, the artisanal skills, and many of the Jews brought from the European countries commercial experience. So it's easier for them to connect with what's going on. A lot of the Catholic workers were not ready to do that yet. It took a long time for, and also the Catholic leadership sponsored parochial schools. Not all Catholics go to Catholic schools, but a lot of them did. Jews went to public schools, and they took great advantage of it, and they were conspicuous presence in public schools. So if you're in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s, if you're an Anglo-Protestant sort of leading one of these institutions, there are Jews around you. You might not appreciate them. You might be prejudiced against them. You might not want them in your club, but they're there. And they're increasingly effective in one cultural domain after another. Mm-hmm. And then when Einstein and the Hitler area refugees come over, you've got all these marquee level people. And of course, the United States is very proud in the 1930s of being open to these Jewish immigrants. Now, of course, they didn't change the quotas, so there a lot of average Jews couldn't get in. But if you were a Nobel Prize winner or some very famous writer, you could get in. So what happens is that you have a Jewish presence coming into the United States, which is almost entirely, not entirely, but almost entirely non-Judaic. So they are Jews, but they are not Judaic for the most part. They're not broadcasting a Jewish religion, but above all, they're not Christians. So the Jewish population as of the 1930s and 40s, whether they're religiously observant or not, whether they're religiously conspicuous or not, they don't have a Christian background at all. So the more of these people that are prominent in American life, the more the Anglo-Protestant establishment has to take account of that. And gradually, they do overcome a lot of the prejudice. So by the post-World War II era, when the GI Bill and Cold War financing opens up the universities, so young Jews come into the university faculties in huge numbers. And so there's a transformation of American public institutions, a de-Christianization of their established order. And this is a profoundly important change in American life and really does accelerate the secularization. Let me give one example. The discipline of philosophy has always been really, really Protestant in the United States. This is the academic discipline that has the most implications for religion, supposedly. So as of about 1930, the Jews who wanted to become philosophers were generally not allowed. So one after another that wants to go into philosophy, no, you should switch to economics, or why don't you become a doctor or something like that. And there are any number of anecdotes told by Jewish intellectual generation about this. So by the 1930s, because of the really strong anti-Semitic prejudice, in the university faculties, and especially the trustees and the deans and the presidents, you do not have Jews in the discipline of philosophy. There's only one, Morris Raphael Cohen of City University of New York. I wrote a book on him some
Yes.
years back. Okay, so you had him. But then after the war, when the anti-Semitic stuff has to stop, it just can't survive the Nazi Holocaust and all, so that universities are no longer just keeping out Jews as they used to. So Jews become into these faculties, and philosophy department just happens to be an example of this. So by the end of the 1960s, about 1/5 of the professors of philosophy at the elite universities are Jews. Now that's an overrepresentation. You can do the math. 3 or 4% of the population, 25% of 20 or 25% of the philosophers. So then by the end of the 1960s, there's this great journalist story. Somebody's studying philosophy, and they go to 8 of the leading philosophers of the United States. So, okay, tell us what kind of philosophy you're doing. And so there's a nice article quoting these guys on what they're doing as philosophy. And it turns out that 7 of the 8 are Jewish. And the author of the article, the journalist, doesn't even mention this. So by the end of the 1960s, you can do an article about American philosophy, not even mentioning the ethno-religious demography of it. And, like 30 years before, it would have been impossible. Now, that's a huge change. And all of academia experiences this too, not as extreme, maybe as philosophy, but a lot of it does. So if we want to talk about culturally influenced institutions, universities particularly, foundations, the Jewish impact toward de-Christianization, toward the end of the Protestant cultural hegemony is very important. Now, I've been frustrated by the scholarly literature about modern American history for not making more of this. And so I have a whole chapter of it in my book because I think it's really
It's
very
fascinating.
important.
Yes.
And I think one of the reasons is that there's a tradition where if you talk about Jewish influence, that's seen as a kind of anti-Semitic trope, as though you're claiming that Jews have too much influence.
Control, yes, that's right.
Yeah. Well, if you start with the view that the United States is a Christian country, and it ought to be Christian now, and it's not as thoroughly Christian as it ought to be, and then you think, well, now, why isn't it more Christian? Well, and if the Jewish population has something to do with that, then, that's like a problem. But if, on the other hand, you think that the changes in American life, the decline of Anglo-Protestant hegemony, the opening up of things, the decline of white supremacy, the opening to the world, the greater cosmopolitan public culture, the affirmation of diversity, if you like all these things, then it's not so bad. So the presence of the non-Christian population, all these Jewish lawyers and psychotherapists and professors and writers, this is all to the good. So I write this from the point of view of almost a triumphalist narrative that the coming of Jews into American life has made America better. Now, that puts me on the complete opposite side of the Christian nationalists.
Right.
I want to get to,
yes, I want to get to Christian nationalism towards the end, because I think it's basically the instantiation of so much that is looming and ominous in American society. But before I get there, there are a few other questions that I do want to ask. The first one, or the first observation I want to make, is that in your lovely chapter about the Jewish contribution in the road towards secularization, you do mention the role of Jewish psychotherapists, psychologists, and psychiatrists and social workers. And I think that they played a big role. I mean, traditionally, if you had a problem emotionally, you went to your pastor. You went
right.
to your priest. But
Yeah,
it's totally normative, even for religious people, to go to their therapist. And Jews played, or I think were tremendously overrepresented. I
yeah,
mean, it was in Europe, but Freud was concerned that psychoanalysis would be seen as an exclusively Jewish field. So he
yeah.
adopted, Carl Jung as his successor, who tragically turned out to be a Nazi. But, in effect, it was a Jewish science, and it was tremendously influential in the American field. And it
That's
seems
right.
to me that they played a huge role,
They
not
did.
only academics. I have to
Yeah,
mention in passing,
yeah,
I
that's
was a
good.
student, a philosophy student of Sidney Morgenbesser at
Ah,
Columbia, right? Who was part of the
yeah.
Jewish, right? But there were others. I knew Paul Kurtz, who was a
Oh,
major
yeah.
humanist and so on,
Sure.
Jewish and so forth.
Right.
Uh, David Sidorsky was a professor of mine and so forth,
Oh,
Jewish
yeah.
philosophers, right?
Good.
But anyway, yeah, I think that I have to just mention, I think that, as you mentioned in the book, a few pages devoted to Jewish psychotherapy. I think of Eric Fromm, I think of Abraham Maslow, Albert Ellis, and so on. Major luminaries in psychotherapy, and their acolytes were Jewish, and I think in many ways stole the market share from pastors and ministers who traditionally did all that counseling.
But
Yeah, of
it's interesting, Joe, that this was not broadcast as a secularization project. It was not broadcast
course not.
as
Right,
de-Christianization. It was broadcast rather as the application of modern medicine.
right.
And so it was sort of religiously neutral, but of course it wasn't.
Yeah. Okay. Before I get to the current moment, which I'm very concerned about, and I think we all should be, I want you to talk a little bit about the apotheosis, as you put it, of ecumenical Protestantism in the 1960s. It seems to me that for a moment, it was riding very high in terms of the civil rights movement, elements of the New Left, even the anti-war movement. I remember going to meetings, even at the National Council of Churches on Riverside Drive in New York, talking about the almost triumphalist role that the Protestant churches were playing in the 1960s, and that was their high watermark. And after that, they began to hemorrhage very badly. I was wondering if you can talk about what happened in the 1960s that caused that decline, rapid decline of the ecumenical churches, and therefore opened the space for the rise of evangelicals and their reactionary politics. Yeah.
the the movement that you describe of what ecumenical leadership was doing in the 1960s, it is indeed just as you describe. Now, several things happen sort of simultaneously. One is that a lot of the people growing up in these Protestant churches are quite excited by these movements outside the churches that their elders are supporting. So, anti imperialism, anti war, anti racism, feminism, all these things you can get involved in. And do you really need the church? So, the church pushes you in that direction. But a lot of young people do not affiliate with the congregations of their parents because they do get very caught up in all of these other movements. And that's one thing that's an important step. But at the same time, the liberal Protestants that you describe develop what we now call more progressive views about women and their role in the workforce and about family planning. So the ecumenical Protestants practice birth control. They're much more for contraception early on.
Mm-hmm.
They're more sympathetic with women in the workforce. So the birth rate for the mainline Protestant churches goes down and down and down, and the result is that you have fewer and fewer women of church-bearing age in these congregations, and they have fewer children. In the meantime, the ecumenical churches are growing because they have a different view about women, so their fertility rate is much, much higher all through this 60s, 70s, 80s period than it is among the ecumenical Protestants. So that's a very big difference along the way. Now, something else, by the 1970s, the evangelical group has developed a very sophisticated modern media network.
Mm-hmm.
And they have developed a lot of schools of their own seminaries, their own radio stations, their own TV things. And they have increasingly allied with the Republican Party
Yes.
to hint towards something that we can talk about a little bit later. But its pertinence now is that a lot of people who might have moved up from the Nazarenes and the Seventh-day Adventists to the Presbyterians and the Methodists in 1948, 1956, so forth, because that was one of the ways you did upward mobility, is you moved up from these scruffy evangelical churches into the mainline swish stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Well, the enterprise of the evangelical leadership, bankrolled by big oil money, made evangelical Protestantism such a prominent thing that you no longer had to become mainline in order to be mainstream. Now, that's very important in the demography of these churches, because the ecumenical mainline churches had been relying for many years on these converts for growth. So if you look at what's going on in 1948, 1952, 1956, the growth of the Presbyterians and the Methodists and the Congregationalists is partly people migrating there from the evangelical churches as they get more educated, as they achieve greater economic mobility, as their children go to college. Now, that changes in the 1970s because there's fewer and fewer people willing to make that change. So that it's partly that evangelicalism has really been put on the map. And also, in order to switch from the Adventists to the Congregationalists, you've got to deal with the congregational elites' commitment to a scientific culture and to an ethno-racially equal society. And so they're a combination of what's happening with the liberal Protestants and what's happening to evangelical enterprise makes it very difficult to continue the growth. So it's a variety of things that come together, but I would especially emphasize declining birth rate relative to evangelicals, and young people deciding that you don't need the church in order to act on its best values.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I want to bring this up to the moment before we bring our very fascinating and important conversation to a close. You do mention Donald Trump in your book, and as you do point out correctly, that Trump would not have won the presidency had it not been for the support of evangelicals, right? Several questions, I think, certainly come together, and that is the identification of evangelicals with the Republican Party. To what extent, I would ask, is race and racism a component of the what motivates evangelicals and fuels them, with the understanding that Republicans had adopted the Southern strategy and sent out dog whistles that basically gave the message of racial divide and racism. I'd also, and here we live in very dangerous, ominous times. Your subtitle of your book is how, in effect, religion has become more conservative. Well, in the hands of contemporary evangelicals and fundamentalists, I would argue that the lunatic fringe, it's not conservative. Lunatic fringe has become normative.
Yeah.
I mean, the attack on expertise, on education, on reason, on facts, on evidence. We now have tens of millions of people who believe in the big lie, despite all evidence. This is a very epistemic, it's what Obama referred to, and you cite this as an epistemic crisis, okay? This has never in my lifetime, this has never happened before. You can't have, let alone a democracy, let alone a civilization, without certain basically consensual commitments to the rules of evidence, to fact, to reality. These seem to be basically pushed aside by tens of millions of Americans. And I would argue that the evangelical subculture, which appropriates, from my rationalist point of view, a set of beliefs and doctrines that are at their base irrational and not subject to evidence, nevertheless, in the political realm, has driven us off the cliff. And I'm wondering if you and they support Donald Trump. I mean, this is so I mean, they've given up the notion of supporting family values. I mean, you can't argue that any longer. I think that basically fraud is out the window in the face of overwhelming evidence. But what they've ushered in or helped to fuel is a social, a social crisis that I think puts our democracy at a precipice. Please explain, okay, how this has happened, and I'll ask you to be a secular prophet. Okay, what do we do to get out of this? And what role can religion of a more rational type, more liberal type, ecumenical type, still play, perhaps in terms of healing these extraordinary breaches in American society? And if I sound a little histrionic, it's because I'm really extremely concerned about this. I'm wondering if you have any answers, both an analysis and a response. Yeah, we look to
Joe,
you.
you convinced me almost that I should have subtitled this "How Religion Became More Wacko."
Yes, well, yes, absolutely correct.
Yeah.
Yes, I think that would have been appropriate.
Well, I think, and you mentioned the Southern strategy. I think that we need to remember that the alliance between evangelicalism as a religious practice and conservative politics in the political realm, the alliance comes together gradually. And one of the reasons that it is a good fit is that in the 50s, when Howard Pugh and other big, billionaires began putting their money into evangelical institutions, they do it because the liberals have gone over to sort of pro-New Deal economic regulation stuff.
Yes.
And the evangelicals are sort of quiet about that, but the evangelical tradition, the religious sensibility, is highly individual. Okay, so the anti-state Republicans, the anti-regulation billionaires, the corporate types that want to roll back the New Deal,
yes,
they recognize even in the 1950s and especially in the early 1960s that evangelical voters represent a great opportunity for them because of the individualist approach to life.
It's an
so
important
that's
point.
One
yes.
foundation. But then as you go on through the 60s, when the Republican Party is trying to assess what its future should be, even Goldwater, but especially Nixon and his circle, hit on the idea of the Southern strategy, that if we can appeal to those voters that are the least comfortable with the Civil Rights Act, with the Voting Rights Act, if we can appeal to the voters that are the least comfortable with those things, which are, white Protestants, we will have a step forward in controlling the country. So Nixon and his people, Rick Perlstein has a great book about this, and also Randall Balmer writes about this. So the Republicans consciously adopt a Southern strategy to go after white voters in the South. And there are several of their writers that even say, we want Black people to vote, because the more Black people that vote, the more white people will become Republicans. I mean, this is right up front. It's not secret in any way. So gradually then, the Republican Party becomes more dependent on Southern whites. Now, that's partly connected to their evangelicalism, with their individualism, but it's also something that intensifies over time because so many of the Southern whites are evangelicals, and the Republican Party, in order to keep that base and and grow it in the Midwest, Republican Party gradually decides that it doesn't need to appeal
Hmm.
to the highly educated, secular, Jewish, liberal Protestant voters of New York, California, Massachusetts, Oregon, Washington. So you can see the gradual decline of Republican Party investment in the electorate of those states right down through the 1980s and especially in the 1990s, and above all, the last 20 years. So even by the 2016 election, before Trump was elected, there were only two Republican senators representing the 16 coastal states of the Northeast and California. And that is because the Republicans had just no longer tried to be competitive in Washington and New York and Massachusetts and California. So the Republican Party gradually decides that it's dependent on this other electorate. Now, this other electorate is not as well educated as the electorate that the Democrats are appealing to.
Right.
It's more religious, it's more Southern, but it gradually, the Republican Party finds itself more and more dependent on an electorate that is not as interested in education as the Democrats. And what we're seeing now with Governor DeSantis in Florida, talk about the apotheosis of anti-intellectualism. I mean, it's working. It's working for a lot of these Republicans. So all this is going on, and you're quite familiar with this. And I want to then, since all of this is so obvious, move forward to say, where do we go from here?
Right.
We historians are not very good at this, Joe. So we like to think that we can contribute something about how we got to where we are.
Right.
But it's difficult to be as confident about things in the future. What I could do is to identify some trajectories that I see. Okay. One trajectory that I see is the willingness of many secular liberals and the willingness of many religious liberals, Protestant, Catholic, Jewish, to work together. In other words, rather than the big divide in American life being between religious and secular, it seems to me that a possible future is that the big divide will be between the Enlightenment and the anti-Enlightenment. So you have a lot of religious Jews, professing Catholics, and liberal Protestants who can work together with post-Protestants, post-Judaic Jews, and post-Catholics. And that is actually the coalition that supports Biden right now.
Right.
So I think that there is a future there, but whether or not it will come about, I'm not sure. And I don't have a strong view about that. I mean, in other words, I'm actually quite pessimistic, but whether I'm pessimistic or optimistic is, anybody can do that. Anybody can make their predictions. Historians are supposed to be good at saying, gee, how did we get here? And to bring this full circle, one of the reasons I wrote this book, Joe, is that I have a lot of books now on Christian nationalism and how dangerous it is. A lot of books on why evangelicals flock to Trump. But I didn't find in that literature, much of which is really good, did not find much in that literature that answered the question that I thought needed to be asked and answered. How is it that Christianity, which was once such a multitudinous and for tremendous force in American history, how did Christianity end up like this? That's what my book tries to say.
Right. Okay. One final question on a personal note. Let me just ask you, given the circumstances and given the limitations that historians and all of us have in terms of predicting the future, which we can't do, where do you see sources of hope? Okay. What gives you personally a sense of hope? I don't know if you have children or grandchildren, you want them to have a benevolent future. If you do, what are the sources of hope, if any, that you see?
I hope my grandchildren and everybody's grandchildren has a future which is heavily defined by education of several kinds. One is, yes, we need education in the liberal arts. We need education about nature, history, and society. And as opposed to technical vocational education, which is what the Republicans are mostly pushing. So that's one thing we need. Second, we do need good vocational education. We do not want to get trapped where everything good about American society depends on going to college. That's a terrible trap. I think a lot of our pundits these days, particularly one of my favorites is John McWhorter, who keeps saying, listen, we've got to do something about people that are not going to go to college. They deserve a good life. We can do something about that. We can change the political economy of the country by providing good jobs and appropriate training for that. So that's something that often gets lost when we talk about how education is the big divider in American society. So when I'm predicating the future on good education and learning more about the world, I mean not only learning more about history and science and sociology, but I also mean learning how to perform a job well.
Got it. Well,
Best I can do.
Well, thank you very much. That's very good. May it come to pass. Let me just say, David Hollinger, thank you so very much for an extremely informative discussion. It's about history, but I think history of the most useful kind in terms of being able to explain and extricate for ourselves how we've gotten to this particular political moment and how religion and the religions have been a force in terms of generating it. I want to thank you so very much. It's been a pleasure, and I hope to have you back again. Take care. Have a good day. And a good day to the rest of all of you. Bye-bye now.